Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Just to recap, we have Anne from Pennsylvania and Dave from Minnesota and Devin from Brooklyn, all on the line. Kin Lane is the API evangelist. He has been the lead author for the Human Services Data API protocols that the Open Referral Initiative has developed. Kin will be giving us a quick overview of what OpenAPI is and a quick introduction to the Human Services Data API protocols. And hopefully we'll have some time left over to talk about specific implementations and tools that work with those protocols, helping people exchange directory information about health and human services in real time. Cool. So, Kin, do you want to go ahead and tell us about OpenAPI and what it is?
Sure. So let's go ahead and share my screen here. It will let me. I'm just going to share entire just to make it easy, but hopefully no one sends up any notifications. So I'll talk about what HSDA, or Human Services Data Specification Data API, is. So I was given the Human Services Data Specification, which we call HSDS, by Greg and team in the UK who handles Tim and those folks who handle, pushing forward the data specification, which is the naming of the fields, the structure of how the data is stored, how that's can be shared in a data package. Greg gave me and shared the HSDS with me and wanted to push forward an API specification. And so the Human Services Data API was born. And so one is HSDS, the API is HSDA, and the API is meant to be about how you access the data itself. And trying to stay as true to the schema being the central truth of what the actual schema is about. Now, when you look at HSDA, we have what's considered the core specification, which is what we're going to talk about today. I'm not going to go into detail on the others, but there are 6 other sub-specifications or sister specifications that split off and try to create separate microservices that reduce the complexity of the core specification, but help address things like search, taxonomy, bulk, meta information, and managing the API. So we're going to focus on just HSDA core today, which is all about getting access and managing the core HSDS specification, which I'm going to jump back to HSDS just because it's got the nice reference list of objects. But HSDA core is just about reading, writing, and updating across all of these core aspects of HSDS. So being able to add, update, delete, and get organizations, services, contacts, physical address. So the core objects are locations, objects, and services. The sub-elements of those core objects are like phone numbers and contacts and addresses and those. So services have contacts, organizations have contacts. And so HSDA is about being able to read and write and work with those via a simple web API. And my role in all of this is managing the that definition of HSDA core that is pretty verbose and pretty comprehensive, because HSDS is comprehensive. It covers a lot of territory. There's a lot of fields. There's a lot of sub elements and contacts. And so if you want very fine grain access to reading and writing on that, it takes quite a few API endpoints to make that happen. And that's my job, is to oversee that. Is that a good enough overview of HSDA, Greg?
Yeah, I think so. Do folks have just questions at this level of describing the core protocol, what it is? We could take a little bit of time later to talk about how he developed it and what might come next, but want to give folks the opportunity to just help guide our presentation here. You can also, as we go, leave questions in the comment field in the chat bar. I have also linked to the documentation site in the chat bar, so you can follow along with the pages that Ken is showing us.
Well, great. So I'll keep going as far as, we're currently, when I was given HSDA, the API, it was at version 1, which is often referred to as the Ohana implementation. I quickly took that and moved it to version 1.2, and you can find all of these actually in the GitHub repo, which Greg will link to. So version 1 was the Ohana. I quickly moved to version 1.1, which was basically just, I didn't add anything or do anything. I just made the entire surface area of the schema accessible via URLs, either at the top level, getting at organizations, contacts, and services, as well as getting at sub-elements, like just adding a phone number, updating a phone number, and being very granular. We're currently at version 1.2, which I think we're gonna clean this up, actually, now that we don't have this, as this used to drive our portal, but now Tim and group have moved that documentation. So we'll clean up this GitHub repo to just be, the latest version will be v1.1.2 rather than API Commons. But if you go into API Commons, there's what's called an OpenAPI specification for each service, with OpenAPI HSDA being the set of core services. And so version 1.2 is very much about going beyond just the fine grain, being able to get at phone and address and those via URLs, that you can get at everything through what's called a full request. So if you hit the API path for /organizations or services or locations, you get a listing of those organizations or services or locations, but you can request the simple or a full version. The simple is just the basic info for those organizations, where a full gives you all the sub objects or sub elements for it, the phone number, the address, all in one single request. And that was the major focus of version 1.2. But you can always see this in action under the issues for the GitHub repository. And if you look, things are tagged by version. So if you want to see what is in version 1.2, this is what was in version. We did the complete, that was the core, but we also allowed for sorting and some pagination. We added some headers, and added the ability to filter by fields. So this is the bulk of what's in v1.2. It's still there for feedback, honestly, but it's pretty much moving from draft to the real. It's what is the current stable version. We're working on version 1.3 is what's coming up next, and we're going to add in some more guidance regarding status codes, error codes, and we're open to feedback. Really at this stage, I really, after stabilizing 1.1 and 1.2, I'm not looking to rock the boat too heavily, but I'm looking for feedback on what could go in here for the next version. I have some ideas, but we're really looking for the community to step in rather than me dictating it. So I mentioned real quick that the OpenAPI specification is in what's called OpenAPI format. And if you aren't familiar with the OpenAPI format, actually I should probably have this open. The OpenAPI specification is a standard for defining APIs and defining the surface area of web APIs and what the paths, the requests, and responses will look like. It's in the Linux Foundation. The OpenAPI initiative is in the Linux Foundation. And it's used to not just describe human services, it's used to describe healthcare, banking, any industry, any API you can describe with it. And full disclosure, I'm one of the members. I'm on the governing group with a bunch of other companies. My company, API Evangelist. But what this is a specification you can. We currently use version 2.0 of the specification. So if you go to their GitHub repository, version 3 is the current one they're working on. We're currently using the last version of it, which is the last stable one. I would like to move. I'm working on a version 3 of OpenAPI or of HSDA, but I don't want to rock the boat, and that's the purpose of this call, is to help introduce people to this concept of specifying the API. And so if you want more information on version 2 of the specification, what it describes, it's all here on their GitHub repository, but we have the human services definition written in OpenAPI 2.0, which formerly was known as Swagger. So you might hear that name thrown around out there. It was called Swagger in the past, but after the move to the OpenAPI Foundation and the Linux Foundation, it became OpenAPI. And you'll see that reflected in version 3. It's no longer called Swagger. But this is the OpenAPI definition, formerly known as Swagger, for the Human Services Data API. This is a YAML document, which if you're not familiar with data formats, XML is one data format that is pretty common out there for describing data. JSON is another. YAML is kind of a newer one that is meant to kind of evolve beyond JSON, and it just ditches all the brackets and all the commas and all the things that make JSON look very confusing to non-developers. And so I feel like that the OpenAPI for HSDA is accessible to business folk. It's not just for developers. This is although it's a machine readable definition of what the API does, it's pretty readable to the average person. The only thing is it's each tab in here. So the tabbing order of this actually means something. And as you scroll down it, you see the tabs, actually represent collections, different aspects of the API. So I'm going to just give a quick intro to what this means. So this top block here, it's called the info collection, and it just gives you a title, a description, where the terms of service are for the human services, the contact info, and the licensing and the version for where we're at. And we're at version 1.2. So that's pretty human readable. That's, even though it's machine readable as well and meant for a machine, humans, you should be able to follow what's going on here, and just don't let the tabs scare you. The next part is where we start getting a little bit more technical. The host describes where this API is hosted at, what server or what domain or subdomain. And because the central specification isn't a particular API, it's just example. And the base path is just a slash. But if this was an actual implementation, this could be a specific domain, and the base path could be like /v1/API. People use different ways of describing the base path of their API. Schemes just represents whether it's HTTP or HTTPS. I prefer HTTPS by default, but I just stick with the lowest, least common denominator. In version 1.1 of the API, or actually version 1.2, one of the things we did is we kept where you can negotiate 3 different representations of the API. So if you're calling /services, you can actually request an XML, a JSON, or a CSV version of the API or of the data, JSON being the default. But if you want an XML or a CSV representation of the human services info, you can request it. This is one of the reasons why we kept the simple representation of the API, because you can basically get a list of organizations or locations as a CSV and dump it straight into a spreadsheet, which makes it very easy for people to get at and work with the data. Now, if you want the complete set of sub-objects for organizations, locations, or services, you have to request that in JSON or XML, because CSV does not support that kind of complexity. So produces just describes what this API will produce when you make requests. It'll produce these 3 media types. Now, I'm not going to go through every API. I'm going to quickly scroll past contacts, because contacts is kind of, well, actually contacts is pretty basic. Let's just stick with that.
Hey, Ken, I think we lost the screen share.
Uh-oh.
Are others seeing Ken's screen, or is it just me?
It's still working for me.
Huh. Okay, carry on.
You want me to stop and restart it and see if it'll...
I mean, if it's working for others, I've already seen the tour. Anybody else missing Ken's screen, or is it just me?
Just you.
Okay.
It's just you, man. You're out of luck.
I'm seeing it.
So each path represents one of the core resources of HSDS. So we're going to look at contacts. And so /contacts is one of the paths. And there is a get method that allows you to get contacts. It has a description of a summary that just gives, a basic description, a more full description. And then there's what's called an operation ID, which can be used in code to as a function call or a reference to this method. And then it describes all the parameters you can pass in when you're querying contacts. And parameters in this case are all query parameters, and you'll see that setting is called in query. The type is a string. The name is called query, for kind of a little bit of redundancy there. But a query is to filter a list of contacts. So if you want to search by, Greg, you can pass Greg in as a value query, and it returns any contacts for Greg. There's several parameters. You can do queries, which is multiple fields. This is what I said we had added with v1.2. v1.0 just had query, one single field, which it would search name. Now you can search by many fields. There's another one called page, which is what page you're at in the results. There's sort by, which field you want to sort by. And then there is order. You sort by ascending or descending. Pretty standard API kind of query language stuff. But basically, these are all the parameters that describe the get endpoint for contacts. And this doesn't do the thing that it's doing. This is just the definition of the surface area. Now, it then gets into responses. And each response, it provides guidance on what the response should look like for a 200 response, saying it should return a contact. This is just a schema reference, which I'll describe here shortly. And then it gives guidance on 500 error response if there's an error. And this is what I meant in v1.3. We're going to get more guidance on other status codes that people might want to be returning, because status codes are very important When humans are out of the equation and systems are just talking to each other, you need to be able to relay whether there was an error, whether there was a problem. And this is how we do it. And we are trying to provide you very fine-grained, detailed guidance on what this should look like. There's another field called tags, which it's helpful to tag paths and methods as with a kind of plain English name or plain language name that can be used in documentation, other things. Real quickly, there's another method for post, which describes how you would add a contact. HTTP verbs. Get is how you get. Post is how you add. And then if you scroll down, there's a separate path for contacts/complete. And what this returns is a complete contact object. And I'll show you what I'll scroll down in a second and show you what that'll look like. But I want to quickly get past that and show you. Here is where you can work with an individual contact. So it's the path for contact. Well, let me not do complete. Let me go past complete. Like I said, you know, this is pretty verbose because there's a lot going on here, a lot of detail, a lot of granularity. There it is. No, let's scroll past it. Got a little bit of a lag here. Or might be, there it is. So get contacts where I can work with an individual contact because I have to pass in the contact ID. And so this is the path for working with individual contacts. You can, again, get an individual contact rather than a list of contacts. And here you'll see the parameter, only parameter available. Instead of a query parameter, it's a path parameter because you're going to put the ID in the path and it's required. And then again, you have your responses. But when you're working with an individual contact, you have a couple extra methods. You can work with puts, which is an update a contact. And you can do a delete, which is delete a contact. Now, so that's the kind of, you know, that's what we call a CRUD API. It's a create, read, update, and delete API. It's basic level access to the contacts. You can get all contacts. You can add a new contact. You can get an individual contact. You can update and delete an individual contact. And that gives you access to the full contact object and allows you to work with it in a common way. So that's where HSDS and HSDA are meant to kind of level the playing field and allows systems and providers and implementers to work together is if everyone's sharing the same data, called the same things, and has the exact same API, we can all talk to each other. We can all reuse the same code libraries, SDKs, mobile applications, because it uses the same API and it uses the same schema. And the data is just what gets returned is what's different. And every implementation can have their own data set, but the interface and the schema speaks the same thing. Now I'm going to quickly reference the other half of OpenAPI, which is the schema. Whoops. So here's every response. If you get a 200 response from getting a contact, it references what's called definition/contact. Now, if you go down to the bottom of the page, there's a section called definitions. And this is the other half of the OpenAPI. That is, it uses a format called JSON schema. And this is basically HSDS. So this is the schema for HSDS, but each API path has the request or the response. As I showed you with that schema reference, it says when you get a 200 response back from searching for contacts, you're going to get contact. And it references this schema right here, which here's a description of it. It's the details of name contacts for the services and organizations. And here's all the properties you're going to get back. You're going to get back an ID, an organization ID, a service ID. And these are the, this is HSDS. So it's HSDA. You make a request to the API, you get back HSDS, and both are common standards. Now I'll show you real quickly the contact complete, and why it's different is instead of just getting that basic subset, you also get back, phones, which is again another reference to phone, the phone schema. So you're going to get back all the data for a contact as well as the sub data for that. And that's really a quick walkthrough of HSDA, the OpenAPI definition. As you can see, I'm at line like 6,000. I think there's a lot. There's 7,000 lines in this definition. And the reason why, if you scroll way up here, you know, this is fine-grained details for everything. If you want to, we'll look at a service, an individual service ID, the regular schedule for the service. You can get just the schedule for a specific service. And many people feel like this is too verbose, too complex. But when you're building fine-grained apps and services, you shouldn't have to get the entire service object back just to show a schedule or just to update a schedule. And if you want, you can get the complete version of the service object if you'd rather. But if you're building Alexa apps, if you're building mobile apps that have limited network capabilities, you don't want that full object going over the wire. You want to be able to go, give me just the phone number, give me just the schedule. And so that's why this is so verbose, because it gives you full access to the entire surface area of HSDS. And so that's the definition. That's a quick snapshot of OpenAPI, which we use to describe HSDA. So it's a lot of complexity there, and understanding OpenAPI as well as understanding how we use it to describe human services data API. But once you really get intimate with it, it gets easier, trust me. But there's always still that kind of cognitive load. And Greg will tell you every time I come back to this project, because I do this role for many projects. And every time I pick up HSDA, it takes me about 2 hours to understand what's going on again. I just don't remember it. But here's a detailed set of instructions that always tells me what's going on. And so this is just the definition, though. We have an actual implementation of this API, which is at a demo that I have. It's on my website or in my area, so it's got my face and my brand on it. But it's got all of the APIs, the core, and you can authenticate with it and actually make API calls. And so here's contacts. Here's the one we just looked at. Well, this is called contacts full or complete. Let's just go back to the other one here. So here's the simple, and it's not so simple. Here's organizations. And here's phones, physical address, fees, eligibility, programs. Here's contacts. Here's what I was looking at. Here's how you update a contact for a city organization or a human services 211 group. And so you can actually get all contacts. Here's all the fields, those parameters we just talked about. Here's the how you post or add one. Here's how you can put an update, delete one. And so this documentation is all auto-generated from that OpenAPI definition. It's one of the reasons I do that is because I have that OpenAPI definition. I don't have to create this documentation. This gets auto-generated, and it keeps this up to date for me. And that's the benefit. That's just one of the tooling benefits that is brought to the table. Is if you're an API that supports HSDA, you can reuse interactive documentation like this. You can put it on your site, and people can play with your API, actually make API calls, and actually use it. As well as it being something that's standardized across all implementations. And
Wait,
so
what's this program called that generates that?
So this is actually called Swagger UI. So this is from the relics of when it's Swag or OpenAPI was called Swagger. Swagger originally started as a documenting tool. It just meant its original purpose was to generate documentation. But that was 2011. Along the way, people have made other tools and services that use that definition. So basically now you can generate code. There are, you can use services like Apomatic that allow you to upload, whoops, that's not it, sorry, Apomatic IO. I always do that, that's why it's in my URL. But you can upload a OpenAPI definition and auto-generate a portal, or you can auto-generate code libraries in a bunch of different languages. So you can see where they have their list of languages. Somewhere here, but they have like, I think up to 12 languages: PHP, Python, Ruby, Java. And so you can launch your portal and your SDKs using this service. And there's just a whole, there's, you can, sadly, a lot of stuff is still under the name of Swagger. So you can do like Swagger API mocking. There's tools for doing mocking. So if you don't want to create a real API, you just want to mock one that people can play with, you can use that. There's just a whole suite of tools that allow you to do it. Where Swagger UI is just one of many. Now there's Swagger API documentation tools. There's one called Redux out there. Redux, yeah, that's not it. Let's do Redux Swagger. There we are. And rather than looking like the docs that I just showed you, Redux looks like that. Gives you a slightly different look. You can also use what Tim and crew uses. They use Read the Docs, which doesn't use Swagger, but Tim did find a tool out there that will generate it from Swagger, or from the OpenAPI, sorry. You can't technically call it Swagger anymore. Swagger is a trademark term. So it's just another unfortunate part of the thing. So you still hear people interchange them. But having that OpenAPI definition describes the API, allows you to generate docs, allows you to generate code, launch portals, and just do a whole lot of stuff that you couldn't do, or would just take hundreds of man hours to do if you didn't have it. So that's really the overview. HSDS, HSDA, OpenAPI, and the specification for HSDA, excuse me, and then the demo portal for it. And that's pretty much all I had. Questions?
So what software programs are currently offering Open Referral API, and which version?
I mean, as far as I know, there's not really any software programs that are supporting it. I mean, we have the Miami OpenAPI, 211 implementation. There are several, Socrata is supporting it. They do city tools, so that would be one of them. iCarol, is that announced yet, Greg? Can I say that?
In their upcoming release, they've implemented not the entire HSDA, but most of it. Okay.
So really it's about getting vendor adoption of it. There's a tool, we have a validator tool that a friend of ours in Europe had created. So it's a playground that uses a specification. It lets you play with it. But that's about it. There's not a lot of tooling or vendor adoption yet. We need more implementations. We need more support. But really, there's that also is an opportunity. I mean, it's just people, need to create tools that use it. So, I mean, that's what we were talking about. What I have in the queue is to create the API, Amazon API gateway implementation for you to work with the name's slipping my mind. What's the tool, the platform that you?
Airtable.
Yeah, Airtable. Sorry, I use too many tools and stuff. So, getting an Airtable translator. So basically what that is Airtable's API has a specific naming and ordering to its API. What I'm creating is a mapping tool that basically works in Amazon that maps Airtable to HSDA. We just need more of that. Anybody who can step up and create, a WordPress, a Drupal, Google, an Azure, any, major platform translation to HSDA is appreciated. We just, need the funding and resources and investment to do so.
Can you walk us through, since this is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around, let's say I'm a vendor and I have an API.
Mm-hmm.
How do I use this? How is this useful and how do I use it?
Your API has a certain request and response structure to your API. So when you have a certain number of paths, and when I hit any of those paths, I hit it with a certain request and I get a certain response back. That needs to be mapped to HSDA. So you need to, your paths need to be organization, services, locations have the same naming convention. And when I hit it, I get the same expected response back. And so in API world, we call these facades. It's like a Hollywood front or a retail storefront that is covering up whatever is the back end. So for an implementation or API to become HSDA compliant, they would need to speak HSDA, and that's basically what I'm doing with Airtable. With Devin is Airtable. He's created a human services implementation in Airtable. Its API is pretty default because it's Airtable. It just outputs a certain thing for everybody, no matter where you're doing human services or whatever in Airtable. And my goal is to create that mapping between it using AWS API Gateway so that Devin could launch Airtable for an organization. They could use that interface to manage the data. Airtable's API, which is not HSDA compliant, could be made HSDA compliant by him uploading the OpenAPI to Amazon's gateway. And Amazon's gateway is a great way to do this because it speaks OpenAPI. It's another tool that you can just upload the OpenAPI definition to. And then it gives you the tools to map to anything in the back end. It's a gateway. That's why gateways are cool like that. And so the Amazon API gateway could be, I'm happy to map it to any existing API out there as part of what we do. The challenge is getting someone to help create that mapping for me. I'm taking the load on doing it for Devin for the Airtable, but translating and going through someone's, so here's see if I can find this real quick. But when a vendor comes to us, and we referral, let's see what's in here. There's like a comparison. No, hold on one second. I can find it while I'm talking. But that mapping translation from someone's proprietary format into HSDA, that normalization, as we would call it, is tedious. It's time consuming. It's not easy to do. Oh, it's open referral / compare. Okay. Hold on one second. Can't type and talk at the same time. But what I'm going to show you here once I share my screen again. Alrighty.
Dave asked about, while you're doing this, Dave Erlinson asked a question about iCarol's implementation, because I said that they've only implemented part of it. I think there's a few different things going on. You know, as Ken has said, this is all pretty complex. And so vendors sort of like take their own paths to get there based on where they are and where they need to be. Like we encourage, you know, we're not trying to say all or nothing here. iCarol hasn't, to my knowledge, implemented the right functionality. Because they said that's just more complicated, but like they intend to get to it eventually. And they've given a lot of feedback to Kin about the search API, and you know, they say they're waiting to see more definition in the search API, and in the meantime, they're routing search requests through their old iCarol API. There might be another couple things where they just like haven't gotten to something, but overall, they've implemented the majority of the spec.
And when he means they haven't implemented the right API, the writing capabilities, the post methods, not right. RIGHT. Yes.
WRIT. Okay.
Yes. Cool. So you're looking at my screen, if you can see it. So I basically, this was back when we were creating V1.2, is errors. I took the errors standard. I took iCarol's documentation and health leads. And I created an OpenAPI definition for each of them. So if you click here, you see there's an errors OpenAPI behind this, this comparison.
Ken, I'm just seeing your video. I'm not seeing your screen.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Oh. Try that again.
If anybody else has questions, go ahead and chat them at me, and I'll make sure that we bring them up to Ken before we jump off.
Do you see it now?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So this is 4 columns, real basic. I created an OpenAPI, and this, you know, I'll do this for every vendor. And I'll create an OpenAPI. Provide me with docs, I'll create an OpenAPI for you. I'm happy to do it. So I did it for errors. If you click here, you see the errors OpenAPI behind the scenes, all the detail and granularity of the errors specification. Very granular. I did it for iCarol. Not as verbose as errors, but they're still iCarols. And I did it for health leads. Then I put them side by side and compared and said, well, what's different? You know, I mean, at a surface here, you know, you have agency instead of organization. And so what has to happen here is someone's got to come and go, well, organization maps to agency. And then agency ID maps to organization ID. And this is tedious. But AWS API Gateway gives you something that's called JSON path, which allows you to map that in a programmatic way using OpenAPI or extending OpenAPI. And that's essentially what I'm doing for Devin and with Airtable, is creating that and doing that mapping, because I feel like Airtable is something that I want in our toolbox to support. So I'm willing to invest that time, but it's going to take me a number of hours to do it. And sometimes when you're mapping, you lose things. There's something that doesn't map to, you know, and so there's loss in that translation. And so each API implementation or provider has to, you know, I'm not going to step up and do all these mappings. I just don't have the time or energy or resource to do it. But if someone wants to do it for a provider or do it for their own API or launch their own facade that is completely HSDA compliant and just they hide their backend behind it, that makes, you know, that's pretty doable. And that's how we can get more people to be HSDA compliant.
Do other folks have questions? We have a few minutes left.
Yeah, this is Leo from Connecticut. I wanted to ask, we are an iCarol customer, and I'm very glad they're going down this road and kind of, doing something. You had mentioned that they're not quite doing it, not quite doing it exactly the way, or not doing enough, so to speak. And I'm wondering what you feel kind of the shortcomings are. What else do they need to add? Because if they're going to implement it, I mean, it's an HSDA compliant or it's not. I don't know what the, what else they could do that would be better.
I don't think it's a black or white. It's not HSDA or not. I would say we need to come up with a percentage compliant. And so they're supporting organizations, locations, and services, the complete representation. So you can get at the entire surface area through 3 endpoints. They're not supporting all the sub-element paths because they feel like that's too much. Which is fine with me. I think that's perfectly acceptable. You can support the complete, or you can support the granular, or you can support both.
Right.
And we should come up with a way to describe those vendors. One thing where they're stalled is we have HSDA search, which there was a search path with version 1. And quickly, the conversation started getting really complex among the governance group. And I saw, this is API kind of design basics, is when, you keep APIs as simple as you possibly can. The core, which is organizations, locations, and service, still pretty complex. And if I had my wish, I would have launched HSDA organizations, HSDA services, HSDA locations as 3 separate services, and people could choose which one they wanted, because some people I don't think have locations, that kind of stuff. Yeah. But I got given what I got given, so I have HSDA core, which has those 3. I split out HSDA search into its own service because I saw there was a lot of requests on it, there was a lot of detail, and so that's on GitHub. There's a project for that. There's a lot of iCarol feedback. They've given very, very robust feedback there. And then there's some other vendors have commented. It's on me now to actually create V11 of the HSDA search. And then once they support that, then I think it's going to be a meaningful conversation. They're going to support orgs, location, services, core, the full spec, and they'll have a HSDA search. Then that, I would say, we could call, technically 100% HSDA compliant.
Gotcha.
They, even without the detail, so they're there. They're a leading provider and they have a lot of weight, and they get to say, well, we need you to be here before we'll be there, and that's basically where we're at with search. So.
And
yeah, go ahead, Leo. Go ahead.
I'll let you make your point. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Greg.
Just to your earlier point, I look at all of this as these are tools for what is really a process. I don't assume that anything is like you turn a switch and it's all on. Like these are like, and I also assume that in any given case, there may be other context-specific challenges to interoperability. So what we're doing here is creating a basic common vocabulary that people can use to accomplish their objectives. So to my mind, if a vendor says to me, we're going this far because that's what gets us the value that our users need right now, right? Unless I'm hearing differently from their users, that's a point that works for me, right? Like we're really trying to make sure that referral providers are able to leverage their resources as effectively as possible, not trying to get everybody to like just adopt open referral, right? This is a tool. And I think the bigger other vendors, by the way, like pretty much every AIRS vendor has told me that they would adopt this eventually. Some have said next quarter for the last 4 quarters. And it really is, I am less concerned with like getting them all to adopt all of this and more concerned with getting users to say, no, really, we need this, like, and we need you to do it for us. Because it's one thing for me to keep calling them and sending them emails. It's another thing for their users to say, hey, we want this. And the other thing I notice is like a lot of our users will say it, but what we really need to do is get users to say it together.
And
Right?
I would add another dimension too, is we need tooling to be developed on the standard, because when we can go to implementations and vendors and say, if you speak HSDA, here's an Android app, here's an iPhone app.
Out of the box or something, right?
Out of the box. And you just, all you got to do is brand it, or there's templates, and once we have that kind of tooling, that puts a lot of ammo in our toolbox to its leverage and to shift those kind of political gears in motion.
That's a great point, and I know that I understand the need for it. We love this effort, and wouldn't it be great? I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong on my vision here, but what it means to the 2-on-1s out there is that if you're with a vendor that has this capability, you can flip a switch and your data becomes available, and then maybe, to Ken's point, you might have 3 or 4 apps you can deploy immediately that would give people enhanced capabilities. So you can kind of, scale it out and that's correct, right? I mean, that's where we're going, Greg.
That's one great use case is yes, like apps that have been developed.
That's my use case, right?
I'll give you another example of a use case that we're actively pursuing with iCarol and also VisionLink in at least one state. You have states with multiple referral providers who have different platforms, and they want the 2-on-1s currently don't have access to their peer 2-on-1s databases because they're in different platforms. And Neil at iCarol likes to remind folks that if you're doing a point-to-point data exchange, it's challenging enough. But if you have to deal with 4 or 5 or 10 different organizations who've all structured their data differently, even if they're using like the AIR standards, it just becomes totally unwieldy unless you have this common vocabulary. Whereas if each of the systems, even though they have their internal schema, they're all able to map to a common schema, now they can start exchanging data with each other in real time.
And I'm further pushing that with starting to build out APIs that complement or augment any HSDA core set. So I have orchestration, which is so it allows for you to like subscribe to it's got webhooks, so it allows you to subscribe to say a certain organization. Anytime someone updates this organization, hit me with a notification, and it would allow orchestration between systems if they're compliant. I'm building aggregation APIs. So how do you search across multiple vendors or implementations? We had one that was done at a hackathon that is a merge tool that we haven't brought into the spec yet, but we're going to. So there's just a whole, I want to have a suite of services as well as the end application that incentivize it. I have the bulk, if you want a bulk loading that will operate off schedule, that's different than your, to limit the load on your core servers and database. Here's how you can do it. So yeah.
I'm also,
diagrams now.
Yeah, just dropped this diagram, and y'all, I'm sure this diagram can be improved. I included this in the report about the HSD API protocols. This is my attempt to sort of break down, where does the human service data specification play a role, in the broader API protocols, and how does this notion of a core protocol and then secondary complementary protocols work out. I'm sure there can be better ways to present all this information. It is pretty complex. This is my sort of first stab at it, with just each set of protocols relationship to each other and some annotation to explain them. I would welcome your feedback in how to continue making it easier for people to get their senses about about what's going on in different parts of this project.
So I got to jump you guys, but put anything in Slack or in the chat. I'll try to answer questions. Devin, I am working on your tool. I will have you something shortly. I apologize. Thanks for your patience, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah,
I have a few more minutes if folks want to ask me any organizational stuff. if folks want to ask me any questions about the process here, you're welcome to. I have a few more minutes.
I mean, I have a question. Maybe it's better for Kim, but I guess if there's slight variations in the data specification, like for the Airtable, it's slightly different than the human services data standard. How does that? I guess when he does the mapping, things just map. He just maps them to be appropriate, as close to the same as it would be.
Yeah,
right. Like it's not like you don't need to be 100. You can expose. I mean, I guess that's what it sounds like is you can expose 90% of your standard of your data through the API. And it doesn't have to be exact, which then gets me to the question.
And you can either translate. You can indicate what's treated in one way in one place and a different way in another place, or you can extend, right? You can say we have these additional fields and you mark them. There's a whole issue where people are discussing the right way to extend fields. And yeah, that's totally possible. Of course, like over time, it's twice the challenge to keep two different systems in sync. But yeah, we sort of assume that people are going to have their own localized versions, and this is the tool to align. But it's gonna, people are gonna have to figure it out. There's gonna be dialects, right?
So yeah. And the relationship between the standard and the API, like how, like the standard is where the conversation around content takes place.
That's right.
And the API, the idea is when a new standard comes out, to update the API, within a month or something.
Yeah, that's what I've tried to show here is like we have a vocabulary with, sort of like a syntactical model. And then these protocols are then built around that vocabulary. Kin has suggested, and I'd welcome your feedback on this, Kin has suggested, and also Tim Davies and the Open Data Services Co-op have both suggested that Open Referral 2.0, right, the next milestone should be API first.
Yeah. They
both suggested that, and we got a lot of positive feedback from folks like iCarol. Right now, the core of Open Referral is the CSV specification, and the API protocols are sort of layered, sort of orthogonally to that. And Kin and Tim both tend to agree, and we're going to have to, I guess, do some research on this to validate their assumptions or otherwise, that an API first approach, I guess, with a model expressed in JSON in the future might be where Open Referral evolves. Originally, we wanted CSV because we were taking a cue from the general transit feed specification, which is just like 3 CSV files, and it's super easy for people with relatively low technical capacity to edit stuff in CSV. But our domain is clearly so much more complex than transit data that we're not, I don't think, getting that benefit of anybody being able to edit this stuff in CSV. Or at least if we were, that would be relatively an edge case compared to the primary needs. And so while I'm not sure, I personally can't speak to, whether API first is right or not, but I think that the original intention behind the CSV first approach is worth re-examining in our next round of development. So.
Cool.
One thing I'm looking to you all for is, I know this is complex. This is an undertaking to really just even understand this stuff, let alone implement it. One of the things that I've heard from folks is that, tools for validation are useful. And I think we have a data validator that I think probably needs to be improved because it was volunteer developed, but if I had more specifics on like what people need out of it, it might be easier for me to get the capacity to fix it. But I would really welcome your feedback, because I don't assume any of this stuff is easy to wade through or to use. And hearing from you, what we need to do to improve would be super helpful. I think that the documentation site that we got up is hopefully a big step forward. I hope that the live developer portal that Ken shared is a step forward, but I'm looking for more feedback.
So that validator tool was something you guys got out of a hackathon. Did I read that right?
The validator tool came from, and I'll include the link to it here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Sure.
The validator tool came from a volunteer. There's a volunteer who, I think he's a groupie of Ken Lane's. And so he followed Ken into our group, and he was like, "Oh, this is cool. I should contribute something." And he wanted to build he also wants to build like chatbots. And I think this was a first step towards him potentially building like a chatbot based interface. Let me see if I can find it. There it is. Yep. We had a validator for the old HSDS. I'll chat this into the, okay. Cool. Yeah. And Ken also built into the API protocols a validator for the API schema. I'm sure we can continue to improve these. What I would love to see is a chat-based interface that helps people figure out, is the data valid, what needs to be improved, that sort of thing. We might get there. So.
Yeah, I guess I could see that being pretty interesting. I do tend to worry if it's not someone who's familiar with, the social service background, but
yeah,
I could definitely see kind of an automated like interview type of thing happening.
Yeah.
Like, here's what we've got, is this right, or whatever. So that's kind of cool. Great.
Yeah. Any other questions or suggestions before I let y'all go?
Greg, I want to say I think you're on the right path. I think the selling point, the level, even the level you were at today, there's, I know the 2-on-1 world, there's very few 2-on-1s that could even follow any of this, right? Because they don't work at that level.
Yeah.
So I think if you get to I like Ken's idea of, having some simple apps, those are going to be the selling points. If you can deliver a service, flip a switch and you get an app.
Yeah.
Now there's going to be some real attention and some real value. And I think you're getting there. It looks like you're actually getting close. So I think that's exactly the right direction to go.
I appreciate that. We do have some apps, like Link SF. Ken himself helped update that so that it speaks the new language, and that's in our repo. It's super mobile. It's super basic, right? It doesn't even have a search bar. It's just browse. I'm still looking for the good opportunity to upgrade Ohana's web search, because like that's a nice, clean web search interface. Only it speaks, the first version of our spec. It has to be upgraded to the new version. And there's a couple. There are a couple others. And Leo, I know that I've been talking with Socrata, and they have at least one, and they're developing more apps that work in the Socrata ecosystem right out of the box. So yes, that's absolutely that's the vision. I think Rasmus, who's on the line, we haven't heard from him today, but there's a couple other groups out there that are developing applications that are open source. The more the merrier. So
yeah, we're working on that as well, and I'm also looking at being able to. So there's basically parts of the spec that I like more than others, and so I'm kind of trying to basically in very small terms trying to navigate the same thing that iCarol is probably doing. Is sort of like, do I pick and choose or not, and what is what's the downside of non-compliance here and there in to a lesser or greater degree. That's kind of that's where I have a lot of questions.
Well, Rasmus, I know that you all are developing your first pilot, in partnership with an iCarol 2-on-1. And I think I saw you and Neil exchanging some notes in the repo, which is great, right? Because I do think we can all learn a lot from just the experience of iCarol and you all coordinating on implementing this. So
right. So so yeah, I think that'll be you know, I'll continue to listen in on the discussion and building out stuff and documenting. I'm now starting to think that I need to start documenting what we're doing so that it's possible to do some kind of side-by-side comparison.
Yeah.
To discuss some of the differences.
Yep, that'd be awesome. Yeah, because we do not assume that this is a signed legal contract in perpetuity, right? This is a living document. It's got to improve, and it's going to only improve by people trying to make it work and sharing with us what did and didn't work for them. So.
Right. But the appeal of adhering to the standard and getting all of a sudden a ecosystem of apps that can interoperate is a huge carrot.
Cool. Well, I could talk about this stuff forever. Leo, it would be great to chat about Connecticut stuff. And David, you and I have some things to catch up on about Minnesota. So yeah, I'm around for the rest of the afternoon. I have time next week if anybody wants to check in off thread. And in the meantime, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.